Webcasting from Southeast Kansas, I'm Jonathan Switzer. This is the Roboblog Chronicles. This is the comments thread for episode 3. Let's get going. Anonymous said, I would love to see more characters from various generations appear, but for some odd reason I get the feeling that Harmony Gold has lost the rights to some of the characters' images, especially the Macross characters. Look at Shadow Chronicles Rick, he looks like some beefed up Vampire Hardy or something now. Actually, I believe there is an agreement between Tatsunoko Productions in Japan and Harmony Gold dating back to the Sentinels production that says that Harmony Gold will not use the Macross character designs in new Robotech animation. This is all to prevent the Japanese animation community from thinking there's some new Macross sequel using those old characters coming down the pipeline, when in fact Shoji Kawamori, one of the big creators behind Macross, has said, we're not using those characters again. They just don't want the Japanese animation community being misled about this. Anything that Harmony Gold does is going to be a Robotech sequel. It's going to be a different kind of thing. So that's why Rick Hunter looks the way he does in the Shadow Chronicles. And plus, consider, it's 30 years on. Of course he would look different. Maybe not that radically different, but no, he would definitely not look like that guy anymore. Skull 23. If you bring back Rem, and I agree that should happen, Cabell should come along for the ride. Cabell, being the experienced scientist he is, could give Rem a hand with the protoculture matrix work, share interesting banter about whatever sort of protoculture anomalies might occur. He usually helps display the aloof Rem's humanity too, since he is Rem's father figure and the original Zor's student. Yes, I don't find Cabell interesting or compelling as a character on his own, but he is a good character to bounce Rem off of. Each and every one of these characters needs somebody to bounce off of, somebody to bounce ideas off of, somebody to discuss, their feelings, somebody to talk to. Cabell would probably get about as much screen time and dialogue time as, say, Gene Grant did with Vince in the Shadow Chronicles, but at the same time, Gene was an important character there because Vince really needed somebody to talk to about his insecurities. And it made for one of the better scenes in the movie. I'm not saying that any of these characters who would be brought in for somebody to have a heart-to-heart with, or, who'd be brought in just to bounce, their personality off of, would be a major character. Do I think Angelo Dante would be a major character in the Shadow Chronicles sequel? No, he might get some combat time, but more likely, he would be somebody Dana stops in and says hi to, and, has a nice conversation about, what's going on with, and, he either tells her, you're doing the right thing, or you're full of crap. I'm not suggesting that some of these characters should be major wheels in the next animation. I'm just saying they should have a presence there. They should, be there for, as supporting characters, to support the characters who are the major wheels in the story. Skull 23 goes on to talk about Jack Baker, and he comes to some conclusion that I find very interesting. Besides the whole crucial Karen dynamic you went over, there's a potentially interesting connection with Marcus here. Since Jack knew Commander Taylor, who Marcus looked up to, has dealt with a fellow fiery pilot like Maya, though more so, in Karen, and also lost his family to an alien race in some versions of the story the Zentradi, Jack could be a more complete role model for Marcus, while the youth goes back and forth in his opinions of Scott Bernard and the Invid. That is a really, really good idea. Now, however, I had the thought that initially, if Jack is brought in to rebuild the Wolf Squadron, Marcus might be resentful of him. He might since he doesn't know that whole history that Jack Baker and Commander Taylor had, that Jack Baker had with the Wolf Squadron, he might look at him as, sort of an upstart, he would look at him as, somebody maybe unworthy, somebody who's just, jumping in here without regard for that kind of history. And, over time, on the battlefield maybe, or, through some shared experience, they become, friends, or they come to understand one another. And then Jack can assume the position you talk about there. That position as a big brother figure, somebody that Marcus Rush can look up to. I think that could be interesting. But you do have a very well thought out idea there, I think. Darkwater said, I think the more you use older characters, the more and more a story comes across like fan fiction. I didn't think of this until about a year or so after seeing Shadow Chronicles, but I think the best way they could have made the series accessible to new viewers would have been to start fresh with all new characters and a new time frame, like 10 to 20 years later. A clever enough story could have done that while retaining the original spirit of Robotech, while at the same time tie up the loose ends of the new generation. And when you think about it, the Shadow Chronicles is the only Robotech animation, besides the Sentinels, that doesn't have an entirely new cast of characters. But of course, the reason is that the original Robotech was 3 separate, unrelated Japanese animated shows spliced together to form a more or less coherent narrative. Honestly, I think the remit of the Shadow Chronicles was to just go in and tie up a lot of these loose ends. To carry forward the story of Robotech using the cliffhanger from the original TV series as a springboard. You listen to Tommy Yoon at these conventions, and you know for a fact that Tommy Yoon is being kind of a fanboy about this, because he always says, and at these conventions, he watched Scott Bernard go off into space, and nothing ever came of that. Suddenly you loop back around to the Macross saga, and I think any Robotech animation that guy would have been in charge of would have addressed Scott Bernard going off into space. I don't think there was any way around it. And by golly, by gum, I think any Robotech fan who went in and did a new Robotech animation would have some sort of hang-up like that. If I were given control of the franchise right now, if I were, penning the sequel to the Shadow Chronicles, I would stick Lancer in there. I would come up with a good reason, I would come up with, an explanation, and, I'll be talking about Lancer, possibly being in the next animation in our next show, but, as a fan, everybody's got those little hang-ups, and I think that was Tommy Yoon's right there. This is the sequel that he was going to make. And while they tried to make it accessible to new fans, they certainly made an effort. I think this was just so much more about, picking up those loose threads. At the same time, sort of trying to create a new beginning, but, I think loose threads won out, honestly. And I don't think we really have time to get into anything else, so the rest of it I'll probably address, on the comments thread itself. So, this is Captain JLS, signing off.